We're joined here on the Colour of Country Life, FlowFM, by Sam Telfer, South Australia's Shadow Minister for Local Government. How are you, Sam?
Yes, very well. Great to chat.
Well, Sam, look, you do wear a lot of hats, but this one we do want to focus on the local government area. First of all, in State Parliament last week, we had Jeff Brock introduce a bill to try and patch up what I think is fair to say is a mess when it comes to all these disqualified councillors.
Yeah, it certainly has been a bit of a chaotic time in local government in the last couple of weeks, and the conversations I've had with councillors, mayors, CEOs all around the state have highlighted to me that there's been a pretty poor process and pretty ordinary communications really through this whole scenario, unfortunately, over the last few months. When we look at what has been spoken by the minister and trying to blame individuals wholly and solely for the mess that has been caused, really does ignore the fact that with 45 different members failing to put their paperwork in, or from all around the state, it highlights that there's issues with the system. And look, there has been legislation introduced into Parliament. It passed the lower house last week, and it will pass the upper house next week with bipartisan support, because in the end we can't have a burden like this on local communities and the uncertainty that it causes. It really is a bit of a patch up on the mess it's caused, but there's not a long-term solution. There needs to be a real hard look at what has gone on with the process of the communications. As the lead spokesperson in the opposition on this, I have been pushing the government to actually have an independent investigation to have a look at the Office of Local Government and X's handling of this whole process, because, like I said, there's too many unanswered questions at the moment around exactly what communications went out, what awareness did people have of what their obligations were, and also what the repercussions are at the end of it.
Well, is there something you're going to try and move, say an inquiry of some sort, maybe in the upper house, to look into this? The minister doesn't seem too interested in having a public inquiry. He just says he's going to publish what he finds and what the commission finds, in due course.
I don't think that's good enough. And this is why I say I think an independent investigation. And I was hoping that the minister might recognise that this is a necessity and task someone with doing it, perhaps the Ombudsman or the like. But if this doesn't happen, it's certainly something the opposition will look at, is trying to get a select committee into this process. In the end, we want to make sure that mistakes aren't repeated. We want to make sure that those that are responsible for this process are held accountable, and in the end we want to make sure that the best outcomes are there for our community. So, as I said, the legislation which goes through is retrospective. It's really, it's a bad situation to be in. Retrospective legislation about situations is really poor lawmaking, but it really is out of a need for certainty for community and for councils. Through this whole process, I think that local government has been really cast in a bad light, and it's the reputation of local government as a whole which is at stake, and we need to make sure that, as I said, lessons are learned from this process and it's fixed up properly.
Isn't this tabling of the legislation, though, an acknowledgement from the government, in effect, that the claims they made that there were some 12 or more communications to the candidates about their obligations really didn't reach people adequately? Because why would they be making retrospective legislation and say, OK, we accept your excuses, we're going to give you another chance?
Yeah, and it's not a small group. This is the point that I keep making in the media, in Parliament, to the Minister. When 45 people caught up with this, there's something systemically wrong with what's gone on with the process. And although they're relying on the advice from the Electoral Commission about the amount of communication that have gone to elected members, I'm talking to people on the ground. I'm talking to candidates who managed to successfully get their paperwork in, but only after a number of failed attempts through the online portal. Maybe they had to email it in. Some had to even text it or walk it in. These are the sort of stories that the minister really needs to take into account, not just the 45 that failed to get theirs in. And some of those were under the understanding they'd had theirs in, but something had gone wrong with the lodging. Some of them had posted them in and then before the due date, and then X has said, "Oh no, sorry, we didn't receive it until afterwards." The whole thing's been a chaotic couple of weeks of uncertainty for communities, and we need to do better than EXA or the Office of Local Government reviewing themselves.
Well, when the dust settles on all of this, there'll still be councils doing their work. And one thing that has been a hot topic, and I know you're also a Shadow Minister for Regional Population Growth, has been the availability of housing and indeed land for housing to be developed. What are we going to do in this area? The government says they've got a policy for key workers to build some housing. I guess that's not going to appear overnight like mushrooms, but ultimately, how do we fix planning? How do we make sure infrastructure is available like SA water, sewerage and the like, so that new housing allotments can be put on in regional towns?
Yeah, the complicated nature of regional growth really does mean it needs state government strategic involvement. And so look, the government have made an announcement that they're tasking a part of Renewal SA with the task of regional housing and, setting aside some of the bureaucrats from within that department to specifically be tasked with it. And look, it's a positive step, but we need to actually have outcomes which come from it. You're right to point out the key worker announcement which they made in the last couple of weeks, and that's about 30 houses in 5 or 6 different locations, specifically as a pilot. That's barely touching the edges when it comes to the need for those key workers in particular, so teachers and nurses and doctors, but it's also the workforce that could be that is needed and should be available within our regional areas that can't be housed at the moment.
Well, what it appears to me from the announcements from the Planning Minister as well, Nick Champion, is they're saying, look, similarly like we did for, I think it was during the pandemic, we were allowing companies to put on housing, on site, that sort of thing, like we're seeing for the Interconnector project. All of that seems sort of aimed at the bigger end of town, if you like. But when it comes to housing local workers for the local sort of manufacturing facility, there just seems to be a deficit there, in my view. Do you agree that there's all of this, let's allow emergency housing to be put on for workers in the big projects, but why not help councils, for instance, put land on so that the general population can get housing as well?
Yeah, exactly. And we don't need temporary solutions for the long term. We need permanent ones. Temporary is fine for seasonal work or for work where there's going to be a specific end date. But for small business, for even medium to larger business that need a long-term workforce, we need to make sure there's strategic decision-making around planning arrangements, infrastructure investment, and working hard to actually attract private investment. So taking away some of the impediments that state government put in place and making sure it's as streamlined as possible. At the moment, the opposition leader, David Spears, and I were doing a lot of regional travel, meeting with a lot of councils. We're out and about at the moment, just met with Port Augusta, Flinders Rangers, Port Pirie, Mount Remarkable councils. And we're hearing the same all around the state, is that local government, sure, they want to be involved, but they can't be the ones that are stumping up the majority of the effort or the money, because in the end, small regional councils are pretty stretched for resources as it is. There's an opportunity for state government to play a key role here, and we need more than just a few potential pilot projects. We need really long-term strategic thinking.
Yeah, I guess just lastly, the Regional Australia Institute, you mentioned Port Pirie there. They highlighted that was one of the hotspots in the latest data on their Regional Movers Index. It does appear that people can't get far away enough from Sydney, Melbourne or even Adelaide, but are we missing this opportunity to rebalance our state population share and get more people living in the regions?
I think in these next few years, post-COVID, and we saw during some of the challenges of COVID as well, people are reassessing lifestyle and where they're living and what they're doing. If we miss this opportunity as regional South Australia, miss the opportunity to make some of our regional centres into really strategic regional centres instead of the smaller populations comparatively with the eastern states, then I am afraid we'll miss the opportunity that we could have to build our state into a more robust area. So you're right, there's significant movements away from capital cities. We've seen that all around the country, and the movement away from capital cities into regional centres is exciting. But if you don't have the supporting infrastructure, the supporting services, things like childcare, if someone can move into a regional centre and there's a job for them, a job for their partner, and childcare arrangements that can look after their kids, well, they might think about making this a long-term solution. But unfortunately, there's too many stories of these things not being in place and people trying to live in the regions for a period of time and then realising that it's not going to be able to suit their lifestyle, and they're not going to make it work, so they end up drifting back to the city. We can't miss these opportunities, and like I said, state government needs to be proactive to make sure that we maximise them.
Well, there's plenty of work to be done in State Parliament resuming in early March. Sam Telfer's the member for Flinders and a Shadow Minister for a number of areas, including regional population growth. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure.